Don't drink that whiskey. Are you deaf or just already dead? The little girl whispered, her fingers digging into the edge of the Mafia boss's sleeve as the crystal glass froze halfway to his lips. The entire private dining hall went silent in a single breathless collapse of sound. Chandeliers still glowing above a table of untouched expensive dishes, while every guard shifted at once toward the small figure emerging from beneath the banquet table. On the polished marble floor beside her knees lay a small black recorder, its red light blinking like a heartbeat no one had noticed until now. One of the senior men laughed under his breath and muttered that a child must have wandered in from the service corridor, while a hand already reached to pull her away. "Get her out," someone said sharply. But the Mafia boss did not move. He was staring at the recorder, not the girl. "Wait," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The girl lifted her head just enough for her voice to carry again. Steadier this time. "They said you would only need one sip," she whispered. "And then nobody in this room would ever hear you speak again." No one answered her, but somewhere behind the boss, the consigliere adjusted his cufflinks a fraction too carefully, as if the room had suddenly become too bright. 3 hours earlier, the mansion overlooking the Hudson River had been silent except for the distant hum of security gates locking into place, and the air inside the West Wing carried the expensive stillness of control. Leather, whiskey oak, and cold polished stone. The girl, Emily Carter, had been brought here by mistake, or so the staff believed, a last-minute addition seated far from the main table near a service archway where she could barely see the head of the room. No one asked her name twice. No one noticed when she slid quietly beneath the tablecloth during the early speeches, her knees tucked against the marble floor as servers moved like shadows above her. That was when she first heard it. The low, deliberate voices of men who did not believe children understood consequence. A name she did not recognize was mentioned more than once, followed by the words "after the whiskey is poured." She had frozen then, her breath held so long it hurt, until her hand found something beneath the chair leg. A discarded recording device, half hidden under the draped linen, still warm as if recently placed there. She did not know what it meant yet, only that it was wrong in the way broken glass is wrong on a clean floor. When she pressed record, she did not understand she had just changed the shape of the entire room. Now, back in the present moment, the Mafia boss finally reached down. Not for the whiskey, but for the recorder. And as his fingers closed around it, he noticed something etched faintly into its metal casing. A tiny engraved initials that did not belong to anyone in the room, except one man standing too still behind him. The Mafia boss did not look up immediately after noticing the engraved initials on the recorder. His thumb traced the metal once, slowly, as if the weight of that discovery needed time to settle into something real. Behind him, the consigliere shifted his stance again. Just a fraction, just enough for a man who believed he was still invisible in a room full of loyalty. The girl watched both of them without blinking, her small hands still hovering near her knees on the cold marble floor. No one spoke, but the silence had changed shape. It was no longer empty, it was occupied. The boss finally tightened his grip on the recorder and pressed a single button. No sound came yet, only the faint mechanical click of readiness. A server passed too close, tripped slightly, and set a tray down with a controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nothing spilled, but the timing felt wrong, like the room itself had started listening. The girl leaned closer to the boss's sleeve and whispered, almost to herself, "They said the driver was already changed before dinner." That sentence did not land like fear, it landed like confirmation of something already in motion. The boss did not respond, but his eyes moved toward the far end of the room where a half-empty glass of water sat untouched beside a folded napkin. On that napkin, faint ink smudges formed a signature that did not match any guest list he had approved. Meanwhile, somewhere deeper in the mansion, a phone vibrated once inside a jacket pocket that did not belong to its owner for the evening. The consigliere checked his watch again, this time slower, and something about the gesture no longer looked like patience. It looked like calculation. 3 hours earlier was still echoing in the boss's mind as he finally pressed play on the recorder. The sound that emerged was not clean. It carried background noise from a different room, a different angle, as if the device had been placed deliberately rather than dropped. A woman's voice, controlled, practiced, spoke about timing, about distraction, about ensuring he finishes the drink before the transfer window closes. Then a second voice, lower, confirmed route changes and security rotation. The girl's fingers tightened slightly when she heard it again, recognizing the cadence of what she had only half understood beneath the table. But something was off. The boss paused the recording instantly. He noticed the timestamp flicker, just for a second, before stabilizing again. It had been edited, not erased, adjusted. That realization shifted the entire atmosphere of the room again, because edited meant proximity. Someone in that room had access to the recording after it was made. The boss slowly turned the recorder in his hand and saw a second mark he had missed before. A faint second layer of engraving beneath the initials, almost polished over but still visible under the light. The girl suddenly pointed, not at the device, but at the consigliera's cuff. "He has the same mark," she said softly. And in that exact moment, the boss noticed the smell, subtle, expensive cologne, but it wasn't from the consigliera's usual bottle. It matched the scent on the recorder's casing, as if both had been in the same hand within the last hour. The boss's expression did not change, but something inside the room tightened to a point that felt irreversible. The recording continued to sit paused in his grip, but now even silence sounded like it had already been decided by someone else. And as the consigliera finally stepped one pace closer to speak, the boss noticed something else on his phone screen. Reflected in the polished glass, a deleted message notification reappearing for half a second before disappearing again, showing only one line: "He drinks at 9:12. The Mafia boss kept the recorder in his hand, but he no longer looked at it directly. His gaze had shifted to the consigliera, slow and deliberate, like a man studying a painting he had once admired but now suspected was forged. The consigliera noticed the change, of course, but responded with a controlled half-smile that did not reach his eyes, the kind of expression built for rooms where truth had to be delayed rather than denied. The girl remained close to the boss's side, her small frame half hidden by the edge of the tablecloth she had once crawled beneath. She was no longer shaking, but her stillness had a different weight now, like she was listening to something beneath the room itself. The boss finally pressed play again. The recording resumed, but this time he was listening for structure, not just words. There it was again, the phrase about the driver at 9:12, followed by a pause too clean to be natural. He stopped the recording abruptly and rewound it with precise movements. That pause, it didn't belong to conversation. It belonged to editing. Somewhere in the room, a glass clicked softly against a plate. A server stepped forward too quickly, then corrected himself mid-motion and retreated, as if remembering he was not supposed to be noticed. The boss noticed everything now. He always had, but tonight he was finally connecting it. The girl leaned slightly forward, pointing not at the recorder but at the edge of the table where a folded cloth napkin lay untouched since the start of the dinner. "That man," she whispered, barely audible. "He touched the same cloth before dinner. I saw him wipe his hands there." The boss followed her gaze. The napkin had a faint crease pattern that did not match the others. Too deliberate, too careful, as if placed back exactly how it was found. The consigliera finally spoke, voice smooth, controlled. "Children notice patterns where there are none," he said lightly, adjusting his cuff again. But his hand lingered too long near his wristwatch, and for the first time, the motion looked rehearsed rather than natural. The boss did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his phone and opened a security feed log. The timestamp for the West Corridor camera flickered, 3 minutes missing between 8:57 and 9 p.m., a gap too small to be an accident, too precise to be ignored. The girl saw it too, though she did not understand the technical meaning. "That's when I was under the table," she said quietly. "It went dark right before I heard them say your name." The boss looked down at her then, not as a child, but as the only consistent point in a room full of shifting details. The consigliera took a slow step closer, almost casual, as if checking on the conversation rather than its danger. "You're letting imagination fill in technical errors," he said softly, but there was a tightness in his voice now, like a thread pulled too far. The boss lifted the recorder again, but instead of playing it, He examined the engraving under the light. A second set of initials, barely visible beneath the first, matched a signature on a digital invoice still open on his phone. An unauthorized payment to a private transport service, scheduled for exactly 9:12 p.m., the same time that had been whispered in the recording. The same time the whiskey would be finished. The girl reached into her pocket then, pulling out something she had not shown before. A small crumpled receipt from the service hallway trash bin. It listed 2 glasses of whiskey, one removed from the order after confirmation. And at the bottom, a handwritten note in faint ink, "Adjust timing if boss delays." The room did not move, but something inside it had already shifted, and as the boss slowly looked up from the receipt, the consigliera's smile finally broke for half a second before returning too late to hide what had already been seen. The consigliera's smile had returned, but it no longer fit his face the same way. It sat there too carefully, like something reattached after a fracture. Around him, the room began to shift, not in movement but in attention. 2 security guards stepped closer to the Mafia boss, not aggressively, but with the polite authority of procedure. "Sir," one of them said quietly, "we should secure the area until we confirm what was recorded." The girl tightened her grip on the crumpled receipt in her small hand, holding it like it was the only solid thing left in the room. The Mafia boss did not answer immediately. His eyes were still on the counselor's wristwatch, on the faint reflection of the same engraved initials he had seen on the recorder. That detail had stopped being coincidence. It had started becoming structure. A woman in a tailored black dress entered from the side doors, his legal counsel. She moved with controlled urgency, heels soft against marble, carrying a leather folder already opened as she walked. "We need to be careful about interpretation," she said calmly, glancing at the girl only once before addressing the boss. "A child's testimony, especially in a high-risk environment, can be influenced by proximity, imagination, or misunderstanding of adult conversation." Her tone was not cruel. It was procedural, practiced, designed for boardrooms where truth had to pass through filters before becoming action. Behind her, a second figure arrived, his head of internal compliance, holding a tablet displaying security logs. "There's also the issue of missing footage," he added, voice low but firm. 3-minute gap in Corridor West. That's consistent with a scheduled system reset, not interference. The girl stepped half a step forward, still not raising her voice. "I was there," she said simply. "The light went out right before I heard them say 9:12. A few guests exchanged glances, uncomfortable but unconvinced. One of the senior board members leaned slightly toward the boss. "With respect," he said, "we're talking about aligning operational risk with unverified audio fragments and a child who somehow accessed a restricted dining room." The word child landed heavier than anything else. Not insulting, just reducing. The boss finally moved, turning slightly so the room could see him fully. "She didn't access anything," he said quietly. "She was already here when you all arrived." That sentence changed the air, but not enough to break it. The consigliera stepped forward just enough to be seen. Clearly now. "Of course," he said gently. "But if we are basing decisions on artifacts found under tables and partial logs, we risk creating a narrative where patterns are imagined into existence." He gestured toward the recorder still in the boss's hand. "Even that device, do we know who placed it there?" The girl looked up at the boss then, not pleading, not emotional, just steady. "It wasn't placed for me," she said. "It was placed for him." No one responded immediately. The legal counsel exhaled softly, as if trying to contain the situation back into professionalism. "We should move to a private review," she suggested. "Away from guests, away from escalation." The compliance officer nodded quickly, already typing. "We can isolate the recording chain, verify timestamps, and determine authenticity within the hour." The room began to relax, not because the truth had been resolved, but because it had been postponed into process. The boss allowed it, watching all of them carefully. He did not look convinced. He looked delayed. The girl stayed still, but her fingers shifted slightly on the receipt. The ink at the bottom, "Adjust timing if boss delays," was now partially smudged, as if touched more than once. And when the consigliere finally turned his head toward the exit corridor, the boss noticed something on his cufflink reflection in the glass wall. An identical engraving to the recorder, now confirmed in a second location where it should not have been, meaning the mistake was no longer hidden, it was duplicated. The room did not disperse, but it stopped behaving like a gathering and started behaving like an investigation that had not yet been named. The Mafia boss stood near the long table without sitting again, the recorder still in his hand, now connected to a secured terminal brought in by his compliance officer. On the screen, the audio waveform stretched across time, clean in some sections, slightly jagged in others, as if the truth itself had been edited in layers. The girl remained beside him, refusing to be guided away by staff, her small fingers still holding the crumpled receipt like it was evidence that might dissolve if she let go. The legal counsel spoke in a controlled tone about verification protocols, but her words now sounded distant, as if the room had moved one step ahead of her reasoning. The boss did not answer her. He was watching something else entirely. The system had pulled up a synchronized security export from Corridor West. At first, it looked routine: timestamps, camera feeds, movement logs. But then there it was, exactly 7 minutes missing between 8:57 and 9:04 p.m. Not a glitch, not a reset. A clean absence where reality should have been recorded. The compliance officer adjusted his glasses, trying to normalize what he was seeing. "Scheduled encryption overlap," he said quickly. "It can cause temporary frame loss during export." But his voice did not carry confidence. It carried speed. The girl stepped closer to the screen without touching it. "That's when I heard them," she said quietly. "Right when the lights felt different under the table." The boss replayed the timeline again, slower this time, syncing it with the recorder's metadata. The engraved initials matched a user credential tied to internal access, not external breach. Someone inside had authorization. Someone inside had used it. The legal counsel finally paused mid-sentence when she saw the boss's expression shift. Not anger, not shock, but recognition forming too slowly to be denied. The girl then moved her hand forward and placed the crumpled receipt on the table beside the console. It had been folded so many times the ink had begun to fade at the edges, but one line remained clear. A modification order for 2 whiskey pours, one canceled after confirmation. The compliance officer leaned in, scanning it. "This could be hospitality error," he said, though no one had asked him to speak. The boss did not respond. Instead, he reached for the digital invoice log again. The same order ID appeared there, but with a revision timestamp added 32 minutes after it had been finalized. That revision had been approved under a clearance level that should not have existed outside his own authorization chain. He stared at it for a long time without blinking. The girl looked up at him, waiting but not pleading. "I kept it," she said, softly, "because they said things change after you stop looking." The boss slowly turned his head toward the consigliere. The man had not moved from his position near the side of the room, but his posture had shifted in ways that were no longer subtle, weight distributed differently, attention no longer shared, silence no longer neutral. The boss opened the recorder again, not playing it, just holding it closer to the screen as if comparing 2 truths at once. The engraved initials, the access credential, the revision log, they all pointed in one direction that the boss had not yet said out loud. And when the compliance officer tried to explain the anomaly again, his sentence broke halfway through as the boss finally spoke one line, slow and precise, without looking away from the data. "This revision wasn't made by me. So tell me who else still has my level of access." The boss did not move after the question left his mouth, but the room around him tightened as if the air itself had been restructured. The compliance officer hesitated before answering, fingers hovering over the keyboard, suddenly aware that every system in the room was now part of something larger than a technical review. Outside the tall glass windows, the Hudson River reflected the city lights in long, fractured lines, like data splitting under pressure. Inside, only the soft hum of the secure server filled the silence. The girl stood still beside the table, her eyes not on the screens anymore but on the boss himself, as if she understood that decisions, not evidence, were what truly shifted power. The boss finally stepped away from the monitor and walked toward the side cabinet where a locked drawer sat beneath polished wood. He did not speak. He did not explain. He simply keyed in a code that had not been used in over a year. Inside the drawer were physical backups, old access logs, printed authorization chains, and internal transfer approvals that predated the current system. He placed the printed revision log beside them. The timestamp matched. The clearance signature did not. The legal counsel followed him quietly, no longer arguing, only observing as her role shifted from interpretation to confirmation. Somewhere in the mansion, a distant television played low in a service room, a late-night news segment barely audible through the walls. A washing machine cycle started and stopped, the mechanical rhythm briefly grounding the space in something ordinary before the silence returned heavier than before. The boss pulled out a second file, personnel records for internal security rotations. His eyes stopped on one line. The same clearance level used for the unauthorized revision had been assigned to only one person outside his direct chain, the consigliere. He did not react outwardly. Instead, he set the file down slowly, as if even touching it longer might distort what it was revealing. The girl noticed the change in his breathing more than his expression. She stepped forward slightly and said, "They said they don't need to be loud if no one is watching the right door." Her voice was not accusatory. It was observational, like someone describing weather. The boss looked down at her then, not as a witness anymore, but as a reference point, something that had remained stable while everything else shifted. He took out his phone and opened a private contact list, scrolling past names that had not been used in months. One call was placed, not to police, not to security, but to an external audit specialist who had once been responsible for internal breach verification. "I need everything rechecked," he said quietly. "Start from the transport logs and move backward." The line stayed open, but no urgency entered his voice. It was controlled, measured, irreversible in its restraint. The girl shifted her grip on the receipt again, smoothing the folded paper with her thumb. "I don't want anything," she said softly. "I just don't want them to keep changing what happened." The boss did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, looking down at the city that had always felt predictable until tonight. Behind him, the compliance officer finally spoke again, cautiously. If the consigliere had that level of access, it would mean the system was trusted beyond its intended limits for years. The sentence ended there, but it was enough. The boss turned slowly, and for the first time, something colder than suspicion settled in his eyes. Not anger, but recognition of duration. "Not years," he said quietly. "Decades." And in that moment, as the realization stopped being about a single night and started becoming about everything that had ever been built under that trust, he understood with unsettling clarity that the one man he had never once questioned was the only one who had been positioned close enough to never need to hide. The room did not feel like it had changed, but the people inside it had begun to move as if every gesture now carried consequence. The boss stood near the glass wall again, his reflection overlapping with the skyline, but his attention was no longer on the city. It was on the pattern forming inside his own system. On the central table, the revised authorization log remained open, its highlighted clearance trail traced in red by the compliance officer. Every entry now pointed back to the same access node, internal, long-standing, never challenged. The girl stood slightly behind him, no longer holding the receipt now that it had been scanned and archived, but she kept her eyes fixed on the consigliere whenever he moved even a fraction. The boss finally spoke without turning. "Bring him in." The words were quiet, but they changed the temperature of the room. There was no urgency in his tone, only direction. A security officer hesitated, then nodded, stepping out. Minutes later, the consigliere entered, composed as ever, adjusting his cuff as if arriving to a meeting rather than stepping into suspicion. He glanced briefly at the table, then at the screens, then at the girl, and finally allowed a soft exhale that almost resembled patience. "If this is about system logs," he said lightly, "I can explain the technical gaps." The boss did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the table and placed a printed copy of the transport authorization between them. "Don't explain," he said. "Confirm." The consigliera smiled faintly. Confirm what? The girl suddenly spoke before anyone else could. The time on the kitchen clock was 9:11 when the door to the service corridor opened, she said softly. But the recording says 9:12 when the driver changed. The consigliera turned his head slightly toward her, just enough to acknowledge her presence without granting her weight. Children often confuse sequence with memory, he said, but his voice had tightened at the edges. The boss noticed it immediately. Not the words, but the delay between breath and response. He nodded once to the compliance officer. The lights in the room dimmed slightly as a secondary feed activated. Kitchen surveillance, synced with timestamp calibration. On screen, a small analog clock above the service counter was visible. Its second hand moved just slightly out of sync with the digital system log. The discrepancy was minor, seconds, not minutes, but it was enough to fracture certainty. The girl stepped closer to the screen. He always checked his watch before entering, she said quietly, pointing at the frame. But that night, he didn't touch it until after he came back out. The consigliera's expression shifted for the first time, not anger, but calculation adjusting too quickly. A phone on the table vibrated once. No one reached for it. The boss leaned slightly forward. Pick it up, he said calmly. No one moved. The vibration stopped, then started again, as if insisting on being acknowledged. Finally, the compliance officer checked it. His face changed before he spoke. It's an internal message, he said. From logistics. The boss didn't ask what it said. He already knew by the way the consigliera's posture had changed, subtle but no longer symmetrical, no longer aligned with the room. The girl's eyes shifted to the man's hand. He always holds keys in his left hand, she said suddenly. But yesterday, he used his right when opening the storage door. The boss turned slightly toward the consigliera. Open the file cabinet, he said quietly. The one behind you. A pause. A fraction too long. Then the consigliera moved. The cabinet opened smoothly, but inside, one drawer was slightly misaligned, just enough to suggest recent access. On top of the contents lay a second keycard, identical in appearance to the boss's, but registered under a clearance level that should not exist. The room did not erupt, tightened. The boss looked at it, then at the man he had once trusted without question. And for the first time, the consigliera realized the girl was not the threat. She was the reason the room had stopped believing his version of time. The room no longer felt like it was holding a conversation. It felt like it was waiting for something to collapse. The consigliera stood near the open cabinet, his hand still hovering close to the second keycard, as if touching it would finalize its meaning. The Mafia boss did not move immediately. He only looked at it, then at the man he had once allowed to exist inside every layer of his operations without question. The girl stepped forward again, slowly, and placed both hands on the edge of the table as if anchoring herself in a place that had suddenly become unstable. That one, she said quietly, pointing at the keycard. He used it yesterday at 9:11. I saw the light turn green before the door opened. No one corrected her. No one needed to. The compliance officer had already pulled the access logs again, this time deeper, cross-referencing manual overrides with physical entry points. The result appeared on screen without ceremony. The keycard in the cabinet had been active during a time window that overlapped with the missing Corridor West footage. Not once, multiple times. The legal counsel, who had maintained composure through everything, finally stopped speaking entirely. The Mafia boss reached out and picked up the keycard. It felt ordinary, light, plastic, almost insignificant compared to the weight it now carried. But when he turned it slightly under the light, the embedded serial code matched a dormant profile buried in his internal archive, one that should have been permanently deactivated after a past restructuring. The consigliere finally spoke, but his voice no longer carried ease. Old credentials sometimes remain in circulation during system migrations, he said carefully. This doesn't indicate intent. The girl looked at him directly. You said that before, she replied. But the clock was wrong when you said it. A silence followed that was not empty, but dense, as if the room itself had started remembering inconsistencies. The boss moved toward the central display and opened the full audit trail. For the first time, he didn't look for anomalies, he looked for patterns. What appeared was not a single breach, but a sequence. Access, revision, transport alignment, and timing adjustments, all converging toward one recurring clearance signature. The same one attached to the consigliere's account. He zoomed in further. Another layer appeared beneath the surface logs. A hidden administrative override path, activated repeatedly over the past 6 months, always within windows where the boss himself had been out of direct oversight. The girl stepped closer to the screen and pointed once. "That's the same number I heard them say under the table," she whispered. "They said it like it was a routine." The consigliere's expression did not break, but something in his posture shifted backward. Half a step, subtle, instinctive, like a man adjusting to gravity changing. The boss finally turned to him fully. "No anger. No volume. Just presence. You've been inside every decision window I thought I controlled," he said quietly. The consigliere opened his mouth slightly, but no explanation formed fast enough to replace what was already visible. The room did not erupt. It narrowed. The legal counsel slowly removed her glasses for the first time since the beginning of the night. The compliance officer's hand hovered over the keyboard, then stopped, waiting, not for instruction, but for confirmation that the system they trusted had not been rewritten from within. The girl reached into her pocket and took out the crumpled receipt again, flattening it carefully on the table. The inked note at the bottom, once faint, now seemed unbearably clear under the room's light. "Adjust timing if boss delays." The boss looked at it, then at the keycard, then at the man who had stood beside him longer than anyone else in the room. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so calm it sounded like the beginning of something irreversible. "Take off your ring." The consigliere's hand froze halfway through removing the ring. It was not a dramatic pause, not a collapse, but something far more dangerous in a room like this, a moment where control simply stops responding. The Mafia boss did not raise his voice. He only watched, still holding the engraved keycard between 2 fingers as if it had become heavier than metal. "Take it off," he repeated, softer this time, and that softness carried more finality than any order he had ever given in his life. The consigliere tried to speak, but the words did not form cleanly. Around them, security shifted instinctively, not yet moving, waiting for the point where authority officially changed hands. The girl stood slightly behind the boss now, no longer hiding, no longer shrinking into space. The recorder sat on the table, still running, its red light steady, documenting the silence as much as the truth. Slowly, the ring came off. It made a faint sound when it hit the polished table, barely audible but enough to feel like impact. The boss did not look at it immediately. Instead, he picked up the keycard again and turned toward the compliance officer. "Lock every active credential tied to this clearance," he said calmly. "Not just his. Anyone connected to his access chain." There was no hesitation in the response this time. The system moved. Lines of authorization disappeared one by one from the screen, like threads being pulled out of a fabric that had been holding itself together too long. The legal counsel finally stepped forward, voice steady but altered. "This will trigger internal review protocols across all subsidiaries," she said. "It will expose financial and operational decisions going back years." The boss nodded once. "Then let it expose them." The consigliere took a small step back, not toward escape, but toward distance, as if trying to regain perspective that no longer existed in the room. The girl looked at him directly for the first time without fear. "You always used the same door," she said quietly. "But you forgot I was under the table when you opened it last time." That sentence landed without volume, but it broke something structural in the room. The compliance officer looked up from the terminal. "Authorization trails are collapsing," he said. "He's being removed from root-level access, across the network in real time." The boss finally turned toward the consigliere fully. Not as a partner, not as a friend, as a system correcting itself. "You were never outside the system," he said quietly. "You were inside it longer than I was." The consigliere's expression tightened, not in rage, but in recognition of duration finally being measured against him. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, but nothing in the room returned to its previous shape. Then the compliance officer spoke again, more carefully this time. The internal audit flag is escalating to external regulators. The boss did not stop it. The girl's hand moved slightly toward the recorder, and for the first time, she pressed pause. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was resolution. Later, in a smaller room with no glass walls and no audience, documents were printed, signed, and confirmed. The consigliere was not dragged out. He was processed out, through systems he once believed he controlled. No shouting, no spectacle, just irreversible removal. The legal counsel drafted the statement carefully. Breach of fiduciary trust, unauthorized access escalation, and manipulation of operational timelines. By morning, headlines would exist, but they would lag behind what had already been decided inside that room. The boss stood near a quieter window now, where the river outside moved without reflection of violence. The girl sat at a small table behind him, given a glass of milk she did not ask for but accepted without hesitation. The recorder was placed beside it, no longer hidden, no longer necessary. "What happens now?" she asked softly. The boss looked at her for a long time before answering. "Now," he said, "nothing changes what you saw." She nodded once, as if that was the only answer she had ever needed. The room behind them continued to function. Papers being filed, systems being closed, names being removed. But inside the quiet space they shared, something else had already settled. The truth was no longer trapped under tables or inside recordings. It was visible, recorded, and irreversible. And for the first time that night, no one in the room tried to rewrite it.